Move over, Grandma. Nobody wants outdated wife material cluttering up the modern workplace. That's what Valentina Reyes said to me in front of our entire marketing team during the quarterly presentation meeting. I'm Margaret Foster, 52 years old, and I've been a senior immigration compliance officer at Hartwell & Associates for over 15 years. At that moment, watching this 28-year-old recent hire smirk while our boss David chuckled behind her, something crystallized in my mind. I didn't respond. I simply nodded, made a note in my planner, and continued with my presentation about updated H-1B regulations. What Valentina didn't know was that my outdated expertise included intimate knowledge of every immigration database in the federal system. What she also didn't know was that her comment had just made me very, very curious about her own paperwork. You see, I've always been thorough, obsessively so. It's what made me excellent at my job for a decade and a half, ensuring that Hartwell's high-profile clients never faced immigration issues. But apparently, according to our new creative director and David's obvious favorite, my attention to detail was old school, and my methods were holding the team back. The meeting continued, but I found myself studying Valentina with new eyes. Her Louboutin heels, easily $200. The Hermes bag, another $8,000. The Cartier watch that caught the conference room lights every time she gestured dismissively at my proposals. On a junior creative's salary of $52,000 annual, the math wasn't adding up. But what really bothered me wasn't the luxury items. It was the way David had been restructuring our department around her suggestions, systematically undermining processes I'd spent years perfecting. 3 weeks earlier, she'd convinced him to streamline our visa verification procedures, calling them unnecessarily paranoid. 2 weeks ago, she'd suggested we outsource some compliance checks to free up resources for creative work. I'd been patient, professional. I'd even mentored her during her first month, walking her through the intricate maze of immigration law that governs our industry. She'd seemed grateful then, taking notes in her expensive notebook, asking thoughtful questions about documentation requirements. Now, watching her laugh with David about my grandmother approach to federal compliance, I realized I'd been played. That evening, I stayed late in the office. Not unusual for me. I'd always been dedicated to my work. But tonight, instead of reviewing client files, I was reviewing employee records. Specifically, Valentina's employment authorization documents. What I found was interesting, but not immediately damning. Her H-1B visa appeared to be in order, sponsored by Hartwell & Associates for her position as creative director. The paperwork showed she'd graduated from Columbia with a master's in marketing, previously worked at a boutique firm in Miami, and had been hired at the beginning of the year. But something nagged at me. In 15 years of compliance work, you develop instincts. You learn to spot the tiny inconsistencies that hint at larger problems. And there were inconsistencies here. The address on her I-94 form didn't match her current residence. Her previous employer in Miami, Sunset Creative Solutions, had a business license that showed it was established only 6 months before her supposed 2-year employment there. Most interesting of all, her Columbia degree had been issued just 3 months. Before her graduation date appeared on the transcript, I made copies of everything, not because I was planning anything specific, but because documentation had always been my religion. In my business, you never knew when you might need to reference something later. The next few weeks were educational. Valentina continued her campaign to modernize our department, which apparently meant eliminating most of the safeguards I'd implemented. David supported every suggestion, often praising her fresh perspective in department meetings while glancing at me with barely concealed impatience. "Margaret's been doing things the same way since the Clinton administration," he said during one particularly memorable staff meeting. "Maybe it's time we trusted the judgment of someone who understands how business works in the 21st century." Valentina had smiled sweetly at me across the conference table. "Don't worry, Margaret. There's always a place for traditional approaches, maybe in a smaller firm that doesn't have to worry about efficiency." I nodded thoughtfully and made another note in my planner. During my lunch breaks, I began taking walks. Specifically, walks past Valentina's apartment building on East 73rd Street, a gorgeous pre-war building with a doorman and marble lobby. I'd looked up the rental prices, units. They're started at $4,500 monthly, definitely above the budget of someone making $52,000 annually, even with roommates. But what was really interesting was the man I saw her with on a Thursday afternoon. Distinguished, silver-haired, expensively dressed. They were laughing together, in the lobby, and he had his hand possessively on her lower back. When they kissed goodbye, it definitely wasn't platonic. I recognized him immediately. Robert Hartwell III, son of our firm's founding partner, who ran the International Acquisitions Division. Robert was married. I'd processed visa paperwork for his wife's charity events. He was also notoriously careful about his image, having been groomed to eventually take over the family business. Suddenly, Valentina's rapid advancement and David's unwavering support made perfect sense. That weekend, I visited my sister Lauren in D.C. Lauren works for State Department, and over wine, I mentioned that I was working on a complex case involving potential visa fraud. The problem, I told her, is that the surface documentation looks clean, but there are these tiny inconsistencies that suggest something deeper. Lauren leaned forward, always interested in immigration issues. What kind of inconsistencies? I showed her photocopies of Valentina's paperwork, with identifying information removed. Within an hour, Lauren had made some calls to colleagues who had access to different databases than I did. What we discovered was fascinating. Valentina Reyes had indeed attended Columbia, but only for 6 months as a non-degree exchange student. Her transcript had been masterfully altered, changing her status from visiting student to graduate degree recipient. The company in Miami, Sunset Creative Solutions, existed primarily on paper. It had a business license, a website, and even a few fake clients, but no actual employees besides Valentina herself. Most damning of all, her H-1B visa application contained multiple false statements about her educational background, work experience, and the nature of her employment at Hartwell & Associates. "This is sophisticated fraud," Lauren said, studying the documents. "Someone spent serious money creating this identity. The question is whether she acted alone or had help." I thought about Robert Hartwell's hand on her back, about David's sudden willingness to restructure our department around her recommendations, about the luxury lifestyle she maintained on an entry-level salary. "I think I know who helped her," I said quietly. Monday morning, I came to work early and began making copies. Not just of Valentina's fraudulent documents, but of every email interaction she'd had with David about changing our compliance procedures. I documented every client, file that had been processed using her streamlined methods. I pulled financial records showing the consulting payments that had been made to Sunset Creative Solutions for transition services during Valentina's first month. The pattern was clear. Someone had created an elaborate scheme to place an unqualified individual in a position where she could systematically weaken our department's oversight capabilities. In a firm that handled immigration issues for high-profile international clients, this wasn't just fraud. It was potentially a national security. Issued on Tuesday evening, I requested a private meeting with David for the following afternoon. I told him I had concerns about some recent procedural changes and wanted to discuss them professionally. He agreed, probably assuming I was going to complain about Valentina's influence or request some kind of accommodation for my old-fashioned methods. Wednesday at 3:15 p.m., I sat across from David in his office with my carefully organized folder. "I wanted to discuss some irregularities I've discovered in our recent compliance procedures," I began calmly. "Specifically, some issues with Valentina's background that I think you should be aware of." David's expression shifted from patronizing patience to genuine concern as I walked through the documentation. Her falsified education credentials, the non-existent previous employer, the visa application that was built on multiple lies. "But this makes no sense," he said, studying them. "Papers. Why would Robert recommend someone with fake credentials? He knows how carefully we vet our employees. I looked at him steadily. Robert recommended her? For the first time in 15 years, I watched David realize he'd said something he shouldn't have. His face went pale. I mean, she came with excellent references. From Robert Hartwell III specifically, I clarified, who, according to her lease agreement, is also the co-signer on her apartment. The apartment, where she's been living above her means for the past 8 months. David's silence stretched between us like a chasm. I could practically see the calculations running through his mind, the implications, the potential scandals, the risk to his own career. This is a serious accusation, Margaret. His voice had lost all its usual condescension. Do you have proof of these claims? I opened my folder wider, revealing additional documents I hadn't yet shown him. Bank statements showing regular cash, deposits to Valentina's account that didn't correspond with her Hartwell paychecks, credit card receipts for expensive dinners charged to Robert's personal American Express, hotel reservations for weekend trips to Martha's Vineyard and the Hamptons. I have documentation of everything, I said calmly. The question is, did you know about the relationship when you started implementing her suggestions to weaken our compliance protocols? David's face went from pale to gray. We both understood what this meant. If he'd unknowingly participated in a scheme orchestrated by Robert to compromise our department's oversight, his career was salvageable. If he'd known about the relationship and the fraudulent credentials, he was complicit in a federal crime. I swear to you, Margaret, I had no idea about any of this. He was speaking quickly now, the words tumbling over each other. Robert just said she came highly recommended, that she had innovative ideas about streamlining operations. I thought he was just helping the company evolve. I studied his face for a long moment. In 15 years of working together, I'd learned to read David's tells. The way his left eye twitched when he was lying about project deadlines. How he touched his wedding ring when he talked about client meetings that had actually been golf outings. Right now, he looked genuinely shocked and terrified. I believe you, I said finally. Which means you're a victim in this too. The question is, what are you going to do about it? David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I'd seen him make only during our worst compliance crises. What would you recommend for the first time since Valentina's outdated wife material comment? I smiled. Not a pleasant smile, but the expression of someone who had been planning for exactly this moment. I recommend we have a department meeting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. I think the whole team should hear about these irregularities. And I think Valentina should have the opportunity to address these concerns directly. Margaret, if we do this wrong, if we make accusations without following proper procedure. David. My voice cut through his panic with the authority of 15 years' experience. I've spent the last 3 weeks documenting every single procedural violation, every falsified document, every federal regulation that's been broken. I've consulted with State Department officials to verify my findings. I've even reached out to ICE to understand what their investigation process would look like. His eyes widened. ICE? You contacted Immigration and Customs Enforcement? I made preliminary inquiries about hypothetical scenarios. Nothing official, yet. I gathered the documents back into my folder with deliberate precision. But if a formal complaint were filed, based on the evidence I've collected, the response would be immediate. The next morning, I arrived at the office at 7:30 a.m. Not unusual for me, but today I carried a different energy. Today I was what Valentina had mockingly called me. Old school. Methodical. Thorough. Relentless. I'd spent the evening preparing 4 identical folders. One for David, one for HR, one for senior partner Harrison Hartwell II, and one for myself. Each contained the complete documentation of Valentina's fraudulent credentials, evidence of her relationship with Robert, and a detailed analysis of how the compliance procedures she'd advocated for would have created vulnerabilities in our client protection protocols. At 8:45 a.m., our marketing team assembled in the main conference room. Valentina entered last, as usual, carrying her expensive coffee and wearing what I recognized as a $3,000 Stella McCartney blazer. She took her customary seat at David's right hand, shooting me a patronizing smile. "Good morning, Margaret. I hope you've been thinking about our conversation last week regarding modernization of your traditional approaches." "Actually, I replied, opening my folder. "I've been thinking quite a lot about documentation, about accuracy, about the importance of verification in our industry." David cleared his throat nervously. "Before we begin the regular agenda, Margaret has raised some compliance concerns that we need to address as a team." I stood up, moving to the front of the room with the same calm professionalism I'd used for 15 years of presentations. But this time, every person in that room was about to understand exactly why my attention to detail had been so valued. "I want to share some findings about procedural irregularities that have come to light recently," I began, connecting my laptop to the projector. "Specifically, irregularities that represent potential violations of federal immigration law." Valentina's smile faltered slightly, but she maintained her composure. "Margaret, if this is about the efficiency improvements I've suggested..." "This is about fraud, Valentina." The word hung in the air like a bomb. I clicked to my first slide. A side-by-side comparison of her original Columbia transcript and the altered version in her employment file. This document shows that Valentina Reyes claimed to have a master's degree from Columbia University. The actual transcript shows she was enrolled for 6 months as a non-degree visiting student. Valentina's face went white, but she rallied quickly. "This is obviously a clerical error. Click. Next slide. Incorporation documents for Sunset Creative Solutions. This shows that your previous employer, Sunset Creative Solutions, was incorporated only 3 months before you claimed to have started working there. There are no employment records, no tax documents, no client files. It exists only on paper. I don't understand why you're attacking me." Click. Bank records showing regular cash deposits. These deposits to your personal account don't correspond with any Hartwell payroll. They do, however, correspond exactly with credit card charges from Robert Hartwell III's personal accounts for cash advances. The room was dead silent. I could see our junior associates processing the implications, David staring at his hands, and Valentina's usual confidence cracking like ice under pressure. "Margaret, you can't just..." "I can," I said, my voice carrying 15 years of quiet authority. "Because this is what I do. This is what I've always done. I verify, I document, I ensure compliance. It's old school, traditional work, the kind of work that prevents exactly this situation." Click. Hotel reservations, dinner receipts, apartment lease with cosigner information. Your relationship with Robert Hartwell III, who recommended your hire, creates a conflict of interest that was never disclosed. More importantly, the suggestions you've made to streamline our compliance procedures would have created vulnerabilities in our ability to detect exactly this kind of immigration fraud. Valentina stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is harassment. I'm calling Robert right now." "Robert is currently in a meeting with his father, Harrison Hartwell II," I said calmly. "They're discussing these same documents. HR has also been briefed, and I've prepared a complete file for Immigration and Customs Enforcement." For the first time since I'd met her, Valentina was speechless. "Your H-1B visa was obtained through false statements about your educational background and work experience. That's not just grounds for termination. It's grounds for deportation and a permanent ban from re-entering the United States." She sank back into her chair, the Louboutin, heels suddenly looking less like power symbols and more like expensive anchors. David finally found his voice. "Valentina, do you want to respond to these allegations?" She looked around the room with the expression of someone who had just realized she was completely alone. No more Robert to provide financial support. No more David to implement. Her suggestions, No more team to impress with her designer wardrobe and dismissive comments about traditional approaches. I want to call my lawyer. That's probably wise, I agreed. You should also know that ICE typically responds to documented fraud cases within 48 to 72 hours, especially cases involving national security implications at immigration law firms. The meeting ended with Valentina escorting herself out, leaving behind her expensive bag and the coffee that probably cost more than most people's lunch. David dismissed the team, asking me to stay behind. Margaret, I owe you an apology. A massive apology. I let my judgment get clouded by assuming that new and young meant better than experienced and thorough. I closed my laptop with a satisfying click. It happens. The question is whether you've learned from it. That afternoon, I received 3 phone calls. The first was from Harrison Hartwell II, asking me to come to his office immediately. The second was from HR, informing me that Valentina had been terminated effective immediately and that security was collecting her building access cards. The third was from my sister Lauren at the State Department. Margaret, I just got word that ICE is opening a formal investigation based on information provided by someone at Hartwell & Associates. Please tell me you're not in any trouble. Quite the opposite, I told her. I think I'm about to be very busy helping them understand exactly what happened here. The meeting with Harrison Hartwell II was brief and professional. He thanked me for my diligence, apologized for his son's judgment, and informed me that Robert would be taking an extended leave of absence while the company conducted its own internal investigation. Margaret, I want you to know that your position here is secure, more than secure. We're going to be restructuring the compliance department, giving it more authority and resources. Would you be interested in heading up that expansion? I smiled, thinking about Valentina's comment about outdated wife material cluttering up the modern workplace. I'd be very interested, I said. I have some ideas about modernizing our verification procedures, the old-fashioned way. 3 months after Valentina's termination, I was sitting in my newly renovated corner office when my assistant knocked on the door. The Senior Director of Immigration Compliance and Security nameplate still felt surreal, but I'd grown into the role quickly. Ms. Foster, there's an ICE agent Martinez here to see you. He says it's about the Reyes case follow-up. Agent Martinez was a stocky man with tired eyes who'd been handling Valentina's case since my initial report. We'd developed a professional relationship over the past months as the investigation expanded beyond what anyone had initially imagined. We executed the removal order yesterday morning, he said, settling into the chair across from my desk. Valentina Reyes was escorted to JFK and put on a flight to Mexico City at 6:20 a.m. She's been banned from re-entering the United States for a minimum of 10 years. I nodded, feeling a complex mix of satisfaction and something that might have been pity. Any final complications? She tried to claim asylum at the last minute, said she feared for her safety because of the people who'd helped her create the fraudulent identity. But when we pressed for details, she couldn't provide anything substantial, just desperation tactics. Agent Martinez pulled out a folder. What's interesting is what we discovered when we dug deeper into her network. Your instincts about this being bigger than just visa fraud were correct. Over the next hour, he walked me through what their investigation had uncovered. Valentina hadn't been working alone. She was part of a sophisticated operation that placed attractive young women with fabricated credentials in strategic positions at law firms, consulting companies, and government contractors. The goal wasn't just immigration fraud, it was industrial espionage and influence peddling. The fake company, in Miami, Sunset Creative Solutions, it was a front for a much larger operation with connections to foreign intelligence services. They were systematically trying to compromise immigration oversight at major firms to create vulnerabilities they could exploit. I felt a chill run down my spine. You mean I was specifically targeted? Not you personally, but your department. Yes. Someone identified Hartwell & Associates as handling sensitive immigration cases for high-profile international clients. They needed someone inside who could weaken your verification procedures. Agent Martinez showed me surveillance photos of Valentina meeting with people I didn't recognize. Men in expensive suits having quiet conversations in hotel lobbies. Women who looked remarkably similar to her, young, attractive, impeccably dressed, entering offices at other prestigious firms. We've identified at least 12 other women in similar positions across the country. Thanks to your documentation and the evidence you provided, we've been able to roll up the entire network. This morning, we executed coordinated arrests in 7 cities. The scope of what I'd accidentally uncovered was staggering. What had started as my petty investigation into a colleague who'd insulted me had apparently disrupted a major national security threat. There's something else, Agent Martinez continued. Robert Hartwell III's involvement was deeper than anyone realized. He wasn't just having an affair with Valentina. He was actively feeding her information about your client's cases. We found encrypted communications between them discussing specific visa applications and renewal timelines. My hands clenched involuntarily. Robert had access to every file in our system. God only knew what sensitive information had been compromised. What's happening with him? Federal prosecutors are still building the case, but he's looking at charges for conspiracy, violation of the Espionage Act, and about 15 other federal crimes. His father's cooperation has been extensive, I could imagine. Harrison Hartwell II was many things, but above all, he was a pragmatist who cared deeply about the family firm's reputation. Having a son involved in an international espionage ring would have been his worst nightmare. After Agent Martinez left, I sat in my office processing everything. What had started as a personal slight, being called outdated wife material, had led to uncovering a sophisticated operation that threatened national security. If I'd been the type to let insults slide, if I'd been less methodical in my approach, if I'd trusted instead of verified. My phone rang. It was Harrison Hartwell II. Margaret, could you come to my office? There's something we need to discuss. 20 minutes later, I was sitting across from the founding partner of Hartwell and Associates, a man whose family name was synonymous with immigration law excellence. At 74, he still commanded the room with the presence that had built one of the most respected firms in the country. Margaret, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a debt that I'm not sure I can ever repay. His voice carried the weight of recent revelations. If you hadn't been so thorough, so persistent in your investigation, we'd have been completely compromised. Our client list, our procedures, our reputation, everything would have been destroyed. He handed me a document. This is a partnership agreement. I'm offering you a full partnership in Hartwell and Associates, along with complete authority over our compliance and security divisions. Your salary would increase to $285,000 annually, plus profit sharing. I stared at the document, remembering Valentina's smirk when she dismissed my grandmother approach to federal compliance. Mr. Hartwell, that's extremely generous, but there's more. He leaned forward. I want you to design and implement a new security protocol for handling sensitive immigration cases. Not just for us, but potentially for the entire industry. The Department of Homeland Security has reached out about consulting on best practices. Your methods, your old-fashioned, thorough, traditional methods, are exactly what's needed. 3 weeks later, I was standing at the head of the same conference room where Valentina had called me outdated wife material. But now, instead of facing a hostile marketing team, I was addressing a room full of senior partners, federal agents, and representatives from other law firms who wanted to understand how to protect themselves from similar infiltration. The key to preventing this type of compromise, I explained to the group, isn't sophisticated technology or modern streamlined processes. It's what my generation calls old-fashioned due diligence. It's verifying every document, checking every reference, and maintaining healthy skepticism about coincidences. I clicked to a slide showing the timeline of Valentina's infiltration. The warning signs were all there from the beginning. Inconsistent addresses, suspicious employment history, lifestyle that didn't match reported income. But in our eagerness to embrace innovation and fresh perspectives, we nearly ignored the fundamentals that have protected this industry for decades. A partner from a competing firm raised her hand. But how do we balance thorough verification with the need to hire quickly in a competitive market? You don't balance them, I replied firmly. You prioritize security over speed every single time. Because the cost of getting it wrong, as we've all seen, is catastrophic. After the presentation, I walked back to my office, thinking about how drastically my life had changed in just a few months. From being dismissed as obsolete to becoming a recognized expert in security protocols. From enduring condescending comments about my traditional approaches to having those same approaches studied and implemented across the industry. My assistant knocked on the door. Ms. Foster, you have a visitor. Says she's your sister? Lauren walked in, grinning widely. I heard through the State Department grapevine that my sister has become something of a legend. The Margaret Foster method is apparently being taught in federal law enforcement training now. I laughed, still not quite believing how surreal my life had become. It's just basic documentation and verification, nothing revolutionary. Maybe not revolutionary, but definitely effective. Do you know they're calling you the woman who single-handedly exposed the largest immigration fraud ring in U.S. history? That evening, I worked late in my office, reviewing files for tomorrow's client meetings. It was nearly 9 p.m. when I finally packed up to leave. As I was walking through the lobby, I passed the conference room where everything had started. I could still hear Valentina's voice. Move over, Grandma. Nobody wants outdated wife material cluttering up the modern workplace. She'd been wrong about so many things. But mostly, she'd been wrong about what made someone valuable in the workplace. It wasn't youth or charm, or the ability to convince people to abandon proven methods. It was competence, integrity, and the patience to do things right the first time. My phone buzzed with a text from Agent Martinez. Thought you'd want to know? Federal prosecutors just announced they're seeking a 15-year sentence for Robert Hartwell III. The judge commented that without your meticulous documentation, they never would have had a case this strong. I smiled, remembering David's panicked expression when he'd realized how thoroughly I documented everything. Documentation had always been my religion, but it had turned out to be everyone's salvation. 6 months after that first confrontation, I received an unexpected email. It was from a young woman named Sarah Chen, a recent law school graduate who just started in our compliance department. Ms. Foster, I wanted to thank you for the orientation session you conducted. Your emphasis on thorough verification and traditional documentation methods has already helped me catch 2 suspicious applications. I hope I can learn to be as detail-oriented as you are. I printed the email and pinned it to my bulletin board, right next to the photo from the award ceremony where I'd received the Department of Homeland Security's Civilian Service Award for exceptional contributions to national security through meticulous attention to immigration compliance. The irony wasn't lost on me. Valentina had tried to eliminate my outdated approaches from the workplace. Instead, she'd created a situation where those approaches became more valued than ever. She'd intended to modernize our department by removing traditional safeguards. Instead, she'd proven exactly why those safeguards were essential. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't elaborate planning or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it's simply being so thoroughly, competently, traditionally right that everyone else has no choice but to acknowledge it. I never saw Valentina again after that morning, when ICE escorted her from the country, but sometimes, when I'm training new employees on proper documentation procedures, I think about her dismissive comments about grandmother approaches and traditional methods. She'd called me outdated wife material, cluttering up the modern workplace. ICE had called her flight number at 6:20 a.m. to Mexico City. I call that poetic justice. As I locked my office that night, I reflected on something my own grandmother had told me decades ago. Margaret, slow and steady, doesn't just win the race. Sometimes, it saves the entire country. She'd been more right than she could have ever imagined. She'd been more right than she could have ever imagined.